Well, we would like to officially welcome you to creating global virtual teams that work. You're going to have three of us working with you today over the next 75 minutes. We thought it was really important in this busier than ever times when we have a lot of added stressors as we're all trying to find our new balance. We wanted to provide you with some global resources to just ease some of those pressing issues, the time sensitive issues that we're all facing today in our global teams. So let us start with just introducing you to our format. This is simply a Zoom webinar. We've all been doing this for weeks and weeks now. We're going to have it be very interactive with you through the chat function. You might see the Q&A option. Please only use the chat function. That's the only one that we're going to be monitoring today. However, you also have at the bottom a raise your hand option. So if you raise your hand, we'd be more than happy to unmute you and give you, oh, I saw some hand raises go up, just testing it, that's okay, because if I see that go up, I might call on you and give you an opportunity to ask some questions, get into a dialogue with us live. Because we all seem to have our bandwidth issues pretty taxed out these days too, which by the way is why we chose the time that we did for this particular session, please just take a deep breath, get a little bit more water, walk around your desk or down the hall at your home office, wherever you might be today, and then just join back in. We will certainly, if we go down, which has happened to Zoom on a number of occasions, don't worry, we'll just get you right back up again. So we'll just rejoin. Well, welcome to all of you joining us from all over the world. We have Mexico, Colombia, Germany, all throughout the United States. And our Asian colleagues, well, they've requested a recording, of course, and that's for obvious reasons if you consider the time that it is there. So if we missed your country, please type that in the chat box. We again will be monitoring that as we go. So again, as I mentioned, you've got three of us. My name is Amy Tolbert. I'll be hosting this session today on behalf of ECCO International. I am the principal of ECCO International. We've been researching global competencies and supporting clients in this space for over 30 years, dare I say. And I am, as you can see and hear probably, now in the Midwest. I've got that accent down really well, and my family doesn't hesitate to tease me about that on every occasion. But I am an East Coaster too, and you'll probably see that emerge as we move forward. Well, let me introduce to you our first feature presenter, Kristy Beckman, and she'll introduce herself.
Hi, all right, so hi, I'm Kristy, and I've been a customer of ECCO International for quite a while, having had a lot of experience with Amy, and even before Amy, other providers in the general space, as I've worked with other companies in other parts of the world where Amy wasn't physically there to come over and help us out. But I have been dealing with change my entire career, 25 years plus in research and development, chemical engineering, and now mergers and acquisitions. So I've had to take a whole bunch of just crazy global situations and make them work to get the business result. So sometimes I've inherited a situation that's already gone wild, and that's usually when I'll pull in, Amy or some of the other experts in the field that are more local to me to say, help, I need an expert to tell the teams that we need to do this, this, and this. And all these learnings are so very, very helpful. I'm also in the Midwest because that's how I connected with Amy and ECCO International, and the mother of two boys who also really love the world. We lived in Malaysia for a while when they were little, and they still talk about how great that was and how it shaped them as people.
Excellent. Thanks, Kristy. And our other featured speaker, Mary Beth Lamb.
Hi, I'm so glad you could join us today. It's really a pleasure to talk about a topic that I know we are all passionate about on this webinar. I've been working with ECCO for 3 decades, as Amy said, and I've been lucky to be a part of it since the beginning. My passion areas are global leadership and what we're doing today, building global teams that work. And in my free time, I am the parent of 5 children between 18 and 25. and I love to travel, which obviously we can't do right now except via our computers. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So does that mean we have to call you Saint Mary Beth?
Oh, I would love that. My children would never agree, but I would love it.
So over our next short time together, the three of us are going to be sharing with you some proven best practices for virtual global team success. We do it in the form of an acronym. We'll launch that in just a moment with you. And at the end, we're going to ask you, so what? So what do you want to do differently? What commitment will you make to trying something different to, again, ease our stress and help build the trust within that team? You see, in this time, we're not so much, we're talking about productivity, but I think our focus really also needs to be on caring for people, caring for each other, having that sense of stability and consistency and that true trust relationship. So we'd like to find out a little bit about you now. I'm going to launch this poll and I'm going to leave it up for just a few seconds here. How confident are you right now when working in global virtual teams? Is it very confident, like I got this? Confident, not so confident, hey, I'm new, bring it on. Where are you in your journey? So I've got about 60, 70%. All right, it's coming up, it's coming up. You're jumping up there. I'm going to close it in just a few seconds. If you haven't voted, please do, because this is going to drive our ability to have the conversation with you, know when we can pull you in, know what type of basically context we should have as we're presenting these models. Excellent, you guys are so on it, 95% of you, we really appreciate that. So here's what we've got. Mary Beth, as we move into this, we've got, all right, so our confident and very confident. We really do want you to give some stories as we're asking for that throughout. So please raise your hand. Again, at the bottom of the screen, pull up your controls, raise your hand. We really want to make sure that we're hearing from you as well. The stories help others learn so much more effectively. For those not so confident, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask for more context for an example, or share a story where maybe you've had some of those nightmares too. Mary Beth, do you want to go ahead and move forward for us? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we've all had those days where we thought to ourselves, why are global teams such a global headache? The good news is you're not alone if you've ever had that thought. I still have that thought after 30 years sometimes. I think probably we all do. And what we find is there are three factors that have to come together to create a successful global organization and thus global teams. First of all, there has to be a strategy that is truly global and that makes sense to the people in the organization. Secondly, there has to be a structure that can actually support the global strategy. Those two factors we're not going to talk about as much today. We're going to focus on the third factor, which I think is often the most forgotten, which is creating global people. Culture is really at the heart of most of our divisions within global organizations. And so we need to create global people that can leverage the strategy and manage the structure. So we've simply got to get beyond thinking that technology is enough. Amy.
Well, why virtual teams consistently underperform, we're really pulling on a lot of research. It's not just our decades of experience. Many of you have contributed to the field, I'm sure, given the roster that we saw. But how do people really achieve their objectives? We know that virtual diverse teams really complain a lot, and rightly so, that global teams are often led by default. It's, if this is what I do in my in-person team here in the US, this is what I'm going to do virtually and with a global team. And none of that can be the same. So virtually, no pun intended, sorry about that. It's got to be different. So we're going to take you through some tools about how to build team charters, goals, metrics, get input from others. Another thing that people complain about a lot, and again, rightly so, is the failure to really leverage what their talents are. What's their level of expertise? If you don't build in the cultural competence piece, and there isn't virtual teaming applied, it certainly is not going to be a peak performing team. So it's not only research-based, but it also holds true in our experience as well. So the model that we'd like to share with you is called the ALIVE model. And it's adapt, leverage, include, verify, and ensure. And we have a series of either tools or tips and techniques in each one of these phases that we're going to walk you through. We thought it's better to be alive and thrive rather than just surviving, particularly when we've got a lot of other, as we said earlier, stressors coming at us right now. So let's take that first one. Mary Beth had talked about in that first model around the global mindset, creating the global people, which means that you've got to have that global mindset to kick this off. And we use the AAA model, the 3 A's. First of all, it's about being really aware of how cultural differences impact business. We know more and more because of the body of intercultural research, how some of this is getting blended as cultures blend, as again, the world gets smaller. We have yet to see what the psychological impact is of recent events globally for us right now. But that personal awareness, knowing when you're on, knowing when you need balance yourself, and knowing when you just need to shut off the world, put up your boundaries, and take some me time. So it's the awareness of where you are, but also awareness of cultural differences and how that shifts and blends. The second then is to not only accept the difference, because you're simply not going to change it. The only thing you really can change, of course, is yourself and your own behavior. So the global skill set helps you to adapt to those differences to achieve those peak results. So it's aware, self-awareness, then knowledge learning awareness. Accepting that doesn't have to be adopting it. You don't even have to agree with it, but it is. So if you're the leader in a team, you can't really fight against that. You'll simply get non-performers. So what can you do to adapt that behavior? And that's where we're going to spend the rest of this. Now that we've looked at the A, adapt, let's go to the L, leverage.
So thank you, Amy. We have a lot of people with expertise in cultural competence on the line. So that 3 A's, the awareness of the differences, the acceptance, and the ability to adapt. So we have a little poll for you now. Who feels that you are familiar with the 5 cross-cultural dimensions? And you have 4 choices. Do you know them? You know them so well you wrote a book on them, or you lecture on them. Number 2, I know and I teach them. Number 3, I'm vaguely aware of those 5 key cultural dimensions that impact teams and business. Or number 4, the what dimensions are different? So pick one of the 4 and go ahead and submit your poll response. And that will help me to determine how quickly I cover these. It's going to have to be quick. It's just a matter of how quick, because our time is very, very limited. So if you could submit your poll responses. And
got about 80, 85, 89%. Okay, you guys are on it. Thank you for such a big group. This is fantastic. All right, so here's what we've got. Mary Beth, this will give you something to work with.
Okay, I don't see the poll responses right now.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, so 0 wrote a book on them. Okay,
Oh,
that's
phew.
a
Okay.
little bit less stress now. Number 2, about a third of you know them and teach them. Most of you vaguely familiar, and just a few of you are new to this. So with that, if it's all right with you, and you can raise your hand or put something in the chat if it's not okay. I will follow that. I'm going to just give you sort of a 1-sentence definition for each of these 5 key dimensions of difference. As some of you know, there are really more like about 23 key cultural differences. And then there are also some experts in cross-cultural communication that try to narrow them down to as little as 2. We have chosen to go somewhere in between. So we're going to look at 5 that I think most impact global teams. And here's your 1-sentence definition. So take notes, because there's going to be a test. The first cultural difference is how people manage time and build relationships differently. And simply put, this is a difference that we are not seeing go away in the world, because it fundamentally gets at how do you feel most comfortable with people, one-on-one or in teams. Those of us that believe it's about credibility will say what makes you credible is what you get done for me. And so they prefer to start with the task and then go to the relationship after all the work is done. The tension is around the doing. Those of us that are what we call relationship first, what makes you credible really with me and why I trust you is because I know who you are, that I like you, that I trust you, that I feel comfortable with you. So my attention is around the relationship. That's where I want to start, is answering those 3 questions. Do I like you? Do I trust you? Do I think you're reliable? And then I'll move to task. Fundamentally, these are opposing forces that come up again and again in working with teams. And I'd like you to think about, what is your preference? Perhaps you know someone on one of your teams that's quite different than you. And maybe you've seen that clash when unbeknownst we think, no, we need to just start and get down to it. Or those of us that say, hey, tell me a little bit about who you are before we're going to feel comfortable going to task. The second dimension that really impacts global teams is called power distance indicator. It's a fancy name. Why do we care about it? It really impacts what people think is excellent leadership in a team or an organization. And it absolutely impacts how we find out what is really going on, which, as we all know, is so difficult to do remotely. We're all doing that today. And even more difficult to do across time, across space, across cultures, across organizations, and across language differences. So this difference fundamentally will say some of us prefer to have everybody be treated the same. We're all equal. We're all good at what we do. We all have an equal voice. And other cultures have a very different view. They believe the most effective way is to work through a hierarchy, to have a leader who tells other people what to do, to have decisions go up and down before we make a decision, and that it's more quick to do it that way. The third dimension, I like to call this the silent killer of global teams, because this one is very hard to see, and it's where global teams frequently lock and why they don't hit their objectives. It has to do with how comfortable are we with change, and how do we make decisions. Raise your hands right now if you are going through change. Raise your hands if you are feeling that there's a lot of ambiguity in the world. If you've raised your hands both times, this dimension is impacting all of us right now in this new reality we face more than ever before. And I know I see that when I'm working in teams right now, I'm often not able to focus, or I think I remember things and then it's gone away. That's because the increased ambiguity and uncertainty in the environment is impacting our brain's ability to absorb. So sometimes we think someone in our team is just not paying attention, when really they may be undergoing a lot of extraneous stresses that we know very little about unless we ask. So again, each of these dimensions is a continuum, as we will see in a moment. But on one end of this continuum, you have people that are what I call the just do it cultures. We don't really know how it's going to work, but let's just jump off that cliff and we'll find a parachute. At the other end of the continuum, we have what I call the just prove it cultures. These are cultures that say, you're going to have to show me that you have a backup parachute and another backup parachute before I'm going to try something new. The fourth dimension is probably the deepest dimension of difference. We're often not even aware we have this because we acquire it about when we get memory, which is right about the age of 3. At one end of this continuum, again, we have what we call individualistic cultures. My identity is around me, my self-fulfillment. Maybe at most, really, I'm focused on my family. On the other end of the continuum, we have what we call the collectivist cultures. The identity and the focus is around the group. Why does this matter? It impacts everything about how we like to work in teams, but it also impacts how engaged we become because it impacts how we motivate people and reward them. And finally, the fifth and perhaps most difficult dimension is the one I think that hangs up global teams the most. This is the one where I think it's really hard for us to adapt. In our heart of hearts, I think we often believe that if I could just convince you, you would think my way of communicating is more effective than yours. Just let me try again. At one end of this continuum, we have what we call low context cultures. Low context cultures say direct, explicit, to the point, use all those bullet points, I love them, is the best way to communicate. At the other end of that continuum, we have what we call high context cultures. And high context cultures believe that the most effective communication is exactly the opposite. And that means that we are indirect. We go around and around the point, and eventually the meaning is made clear. Why do we do that? Because we want to preserve the relationship. We want to avoid conflict. Everything happens through people. So those 5 dimensions, as we see on our next slide, really can be put together as 5 separate continua. And I like to think of it this way. If you're trying to understand how to work more effectively in a cross-cultural, cross-border team, you need to take 2 steps. If you have a new team, and I know I'm on one right now, where there are some people on it I don't know at all, I can start first with thinking about the national norms for that person's culture. Every group has a norm. It's the top of the bell curve. It'll be true for about 75 to 80% of a group. But as I get to know my team members, I am going to need to go to step 2. And in step 2, you see that we need to find out what the individual differences are of the people that I'm working with. What is the individual history and geography and politics and background of that person? And that will impact their preferences. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that we have these 5 key dimensions. And again, a country can find itself here, an organization can be placed here, and certainly individuals can be placed here. So let's go to the next slide, and you'll see that here are examples based on 50 years of research of studies that have been done over and over again around the world, that again, for cultural norms, so if I was working on a German, US, Chinese team, and I didn't yet know my partners well, I could look at this map. I like to call it a cultural map. And I would see, well, what do you see? You tell me. What do you notice about the 3 countries and where they're positioned on this map? Take a look, if you will, just at China and the US to start. What do you notice about the group norms for those cultures?
Hey, Mary
Anybody?
Beth, we have
Yes.
a question for where is India in here? So
Okay.
before you respond to that, I'd like to just remind everybody, you can type in the chat box any questions that you have. You can also type in the chat box an answer maybe when she's saying, what are you noticing about this? But would really like for you to just raise your hand and then I will unmute you and you'll be able to have a conversation with us. So I got a little bit more control there because of the number of people and the fact that it's a webinar. But please feel free to interact with us. So Mary Beth, the question again was, where is India in here?
So India, I'd like to ask somebody in the group because we've got some experts there. What do you think about India? I know Peter Bailey is on this call, and I know that he's been to India and done a lot of work there. So Peter, thoughts?
I can't unmute him until he raises his hand, just in case.
Oh, okay. Can you raise your hand, Peter?
There he is. Awesome. Hey, Peter.
Peter.
Let me unmute you. Oh, I allowed him to talk, but you got to unmute yourself, my friend.
Peter, you got to unmute yourself, I guess. Your mute's on still. We can see the little, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for doing this. And I would be remiss to say that you could place India as a country because it's broken into so many different divisions. But generally speaking, they would be highly relational, much more hierarchical, lots of flex on the risk-oriented line, probably a lot more we culture, and definitely higher context in terms of the relationship connection. Very fun to think, where is India as a country? But then I quickly go, where are my Indian colleagues? And are they to the left or the right of me? And
Yes.
so I love how you've said, clearly you can do this organizationally, you can do it by country, but it really comes down to individual.
Yes.
Peter, we often will call that kind of the big conundrum in the intercultural world, right? Because as soon as you think you got it with India, you'll have a case where it's the opposite. Yes?
Right. In fact, one of my favorite sayings is, every truth about India is a lie.
Yeah, and Peter,
because of the diversity of everything.
Yes.
Peter, I think you also raise a great point. Thank you. That this is the first step, right? So first step, I start, if I don't know my colleagues at all, I start with the group norm. But the second step is the crucial step to make sure that I don't stereotype or that I don't eliminate things such as regional differences, like Peter talked about, which are equally critical in really any country. So if we go to the next slide, you will see as an example of our next step that we put up here Kristy's cultural map.
Kristy.
And what do you notice about where Kristy is compared to the US norms? You may recall from that Kristy—
Let me just hop back. So get this in your head, right?
Yep.
And now here's where Kristy would put herself.
So in your chat, name one dimension where you notice that Kristy's cultural map is significantly different than the US national norm. If you see in your chat, you could just type in one for me, where she was quite a bit different than the national norm. Yeah, I see context, and that's absolutely the case. The US is what we call a lower context culture. We prefer to be direct, short, linear, to the point. Kristy is more than 2/3 of the way to the other side of the line. And so if I make an assumption that she's going to want direct, short, and to the point, that's not really probably what works well for Kristy. And I know when the first time that I met her, she wanted to know a little bit about who I was. She wanted to know about my background. When I asked her about hers, we had a wonderful conversation. It doesn't mean Kristy doesn't get things done. She gets a lot of things done. We went then right to the point after we kind of got through those 3 questions. Do we like each other? Do we feel comfortable with each other? Do we think each other's credible? So one is not necessarily right or wrong, good or bad. It's just different. And so if I think about any time I work with a global team, I'd like you to use this as a set of lenses through which to see your teammates. And I'll give you a tip, and that is you can share this with your teams, and then they can plot themselves on each of these continuums. Connect the dots. I like to actually connect them so we can see each person's cultural map by connecting all 5 of these continua. And then we can learn who really are we working with? What are their preferences? How do I use this knowledge before I get on a call to be more effective with you? Because if you're more comfortable with me, you're gonna like working with me. If you like working with me, you might answer my email first. You might be willing to lead that next webinar.
So can I just ask, Kristy, would you jump in here and talk a little bit about what this was like when we asked you to do this for the first time in a session with us, and what that felt like, and just kind of talk a little bit about what the process was for how you came up with your cross-cultural map.
So first of all, I had to refresh on what each of these things means, because I am not the expert, even though I do try to always remind my colleagues that there are these dimensions and we need to think about them. And then I took a stab at it without looking at what my country norm is, because I didn't want to be swayed with how Americans typically present. But then I reflected on that, like, well, am I really this far to the right or this far to the left? The thing that's interesting about me and context is I'll go around and around about the person, because I care about the person, but I am such a get-her-done person. Like, as soon as I know that I care about this person, we can get to it, and, you know, just we can cut everything down to super fast and quick and moving forward. The other thing on mine that is really different from the rest of the United States is the risk orientation. And I think that's been impacted just by the experiences I've had through my career so far. You know, I've worked for 4 different companies around the world. I worked, one of my very first jobs while I was being paid for by Caterpillar, the construction equipment company, was working at MIT with a whole slew of researchers, because we were sponsoring a lot of research over there. All of them, you know, pretty young in their lives, interacting with people from other countries for the first time ever. It was like a constant fight. Nobody got each other. Everybody was always like at each other's throats, not liking the way this person answered that question or whatever. Yet here we all were inventing stuff together and developing new science and new technologies to bring to the world. So I had to bring all of this into that picture. But then just seeing, like, I don't know, maybe some of that entrepreneurial spirit rubbed off, you know, just being risk oriented. And then through my career, you know, I've had a number of pretty cool inventions take root. So I guess I've gotten used to taking a risk here and there.
Thank you.
Great example. And it does start, as Amy said, and as Kristy has just reinforced, with self-awareness. So where am I on each of these continua? And I think a humbling but interesting exercise is also to ask your family or your best friends where they would place you. Because I think sometimes we think we know ourselves, but the way that we present is perhaps different, especially when we're under stress. So I'd like to challenge you to get different viewpoints on this. Start with understanding yourself. And then before you have any global team interaction, you can take a stab at placing your counterparts on this continuum. And then have that conversation with them. How do you like to work? What would make this work well for you? And that will help you then to get a better idea of their preferences. And this is a guide you can go to again and again. You can use it individually. You can use it in a team, as Kristy said. When she does mergers and acquisitions, she can plot two organizations on these continua and say, where are we the same? That's a commonality we can build on. Where are we different? Especially where are perhaps the unseen differences? Those are things we want to leverage, not necessarily deny, denigrate, or try to suffocate. And that's often why cross-cultural mergers fail, because we eliminate this step of doing what we call a cultural audit. So I hope this will be useful to you. I'll give you one last way you can apply it, and that's also functions. So if I was to take someone who's an engineer and someone who is in sales, do their functions impact the way they behave? I think the answer would probably be yes. And sometimes functions will lock on these differences as well as teams. So if you're working in a cross-functional team, understanding these differences, I think, becomes even more helpful. Thank you. Amy, next slide.
You know, we've typically done this in person, right? I mean, we often will talk about how to have this conversation one-on-one, but within small groups and teams, this is a perfect opportunity to use an annotation function within a Zoom meeting, any other platforms that you have, and have people notate and really get that particular conversation going along one continua at a time. So great examples that Mary Beth gave, and Peter and Kristy, thanks for jumping in there too. So now we're moving to include. How do we include? As we're looking at this, there are three key questions, and one of them, Mary Beth just alluded to. How would you like to see this go? You know, at the beginning of this group conversation, this global team process, how would you like to see this go? What would make it work for you? Which are very broad, open-ended questions. And is there anything else, which is really that catch-all? So when you want to pull information across these various continua, and I'll just swing back to that again, you can see how different individuals would respond to those questions differently. How would you like to see this go? You're going to be able to identify which side of the continua they might be on personally, because they may not be within the country norm, or they may be dead on within that country norm. You'll have a sense of where would you like to see this go and what would make it work for you in terms of the power distance indicator. So that's how this model works and how all of these pieces build on each other. Kristy, you have a really interesting story here about when you first used these three questions with your leaders and kind of some of the feedback that they gave you that was fairly significant for you. Tell us about that.
Well, it kind of goes into like this whole journey for my company, H.B. Fuller, and becoming more global. Not to say that we wouldn't have gotten there without me, but I've just got this view of, you know, the experiences that happened around me. I was brought in about 10 years ago, and my first role there was to oversee this global function, which was, actually it was 5 global functions, but the one that we had the biggest issue with was our analytical chemistry department. So it was one centralized place where all the biggest science was supposed to be happening for the whole global company. And on the first day that I got to work, I just had leaders from around the world screaming at me, like, your department's terrible, nobody ever responds. And I was pretty nervous about my first job. But ultimately, I found that it was because our group wasn't catering in any way, shape, or form to what the other regions needed from them by way of communication back and forth, even the context piece. My team was so used to just receiving instructions on the task that needed to be done that they weren't developing any sort of a relationship with the requester, which would often drop things just cold before the work even got started. So that's just a little snippet into the experience. But working with that team and then pulling in Amy to help coach and counsel them to be a little bit more like liaison-esque, to open up these conversations and ask them, you know, how would you even like to see this research go, is a great way to get things started.
Excellent, thank you. So they're big, broad questions, right? We're talking about inclusion, including. How do you know how to include if you don't ask the questions to identify what it is that they need? Which leads then to our best practices for virtual team success. And we would like for you to respond to this, please. What of these three options, what do you think are two that are best practices for global team success? So I think this is multiple choice, if I did it correctly. So you get to choose one or two of these, hopefully choose two, because that's what we're asking you for. Establish a ground rule that all participate verbally to support inclusion. Move slow to go fast, and create a team charter with roles and rules. So what are the two that you think need to be there? I've got about, wow, you're still really right on it. I got about half of you. I'm still looking for the other half. I know it's a lot of people, so take a moment to read. And we'll end it in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, here we go. This is what we found. Well, you know, you're right on the money with the last one. Creating a team charter with both the rules and the rules. So we'll go through that in just a moment. We have a particular tool that we use that we're happy to send you if you shoot us an email. Move slow to go fast. We kind of borrowed that from the GE model many years ago. Moving slow to go fast, particularly in a global environment for obvious reasons. The one that we put in there was a little bit of a trip up, was the first one, to establish a ground rule where all participate verbally to support inclusion. It was a little tricky because this is the inclusion letter, right, of our Alive model. But for all to participate verbally as a rule, when some cultures may not feel comfortable, depending on the makeup of the team, you may be flying square in the face of a hierarchical issue, a power distance issue. They may not have enough context to be able to answer, and so they may just give you the answer you want to hear to get off the hook, which then it appears like they're not being truthful, which isn't at all what happened. They're trying to support you in the best way they can with limited information and not falling on their face and saving the face of others. So it gets really complicated, and I know that's pretty tricky, but from a US perspective, we do a lot of diversity, inclusion, and equity work as well. That certainly would be one of our ground rules, but not in a virtual global team environment. So with that, we're going to go to what are then the 6. Well, we do recommend, when possible, a team meeting that's face-to-face. Now, we know that things are very different right now. However, look at what we're doing now. Mary Beth and Kristy and I had many meetings around this session, even though we had this content all together. The 3 of us have presented this content before. The 3 of us have done a lot of different business opportunities together, but we've never done it in a virtual environment. And so we had our meetings with cameras on, never muting, just seeing what the full environment looks like. And that face-to-face makes a huge difference. One of the biggest things that I've learned, even over these last, I'm going to say 5 or 6 years, not even in the last 6-8 weeks, is that when we're coaching global individuals that are coaching others in other countries, they'll say, I'm just not getting anywhere. I had great success with this person and not with this one. Well, what are the variables? What are the factors that are different? And it almost always comes down to this. I have to see you, even in a global context. I need to read the environment. There are things that you can tell about me and Mary Beth and Kristy by our virtual environments. the way that we present ourselves. I'm pretty expressive. Mary Beth is really expressive. Well, Kristy is too, and that, so you're kind of getting it all with us. But you know, that face-to-face piece becomes really important, even if it's virtual. Building a team charter. We have a team charter that's established. Again, we'll be happy to email that to you after the session if you shoot us an email. Find your active team sponsor. Who is it that's going to help you navigate when you get hung up with cultural barriers and also systemic barriers? It's not just one or the other. It might be both. So who could that sponsor be that's going to help you navigate and help remove some of those barriers? Setting realistic expectations, again, that's where the move slow to go fast comes in. Creating those team rules for accountability. It may not be that everyone speaks up. It may be that you end up having a reminder or something like Trello or Baseline, or what's another one of those systems, you know, where you manage everything online. Google Docs as well with calendars. Things that really create a system that can hold people accountable, not just a verbal, yes, I understand, because it's not going to be surprised. It's not going to be the result that you want, and you probably shouldn't be surprised. That's why these are the best practices. And then that measurable progress frequently, reporting on it, letting people know, not just sitting on it. It may not be that big of a deal in terms of moving the needle to you, but it might be really significant where others could learn from your experience. Now, we've got a few questions here about the recording. And yes, we are recording this. We will be sending out in the next couple business days an email to all of you with the recording, with additional resources and a survey. So you'll probably be getting that on Monday or Tuesday of next week. So keep an eye out for that. And if you need anything else from us, our email and contact information will be in there as well. If anything, this is the time when we all need to be supporting each other. And this is what some of the elements are of the team charter. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Again, we can get you the details on this, but very specific elements with what goes into a team charter. Well, we're right on time, and we're going to now launch into Kristy sharing with you how H.B. Fuller makes global teams work. She's got some great stories and examples for you.
Good. Okay, so yeah, before we launch into this, I figure I should let you know a little bit about the company I'm working for currently. It's called H.B. Fuller, and we are a global chemicals manufacturer focused primarily on the adhesives markets. Adhesives go into a lot of things, so we break down our markets into 28 different market segments. But we're operating those all in a global way. So we have operations on 6 continents in 40 different countries. So even within our own internal teams, we cannot lose any time on misunderstanding and miscommunications. We do a ton of global work. As I also mentioned, though, we are organized globally. So often it will be a person in the US that is trying to gain business from somebody in India or Ecuador, you know, just any different place in the world we could be in interactions with any given moment of any day. In addition to that, we acquire pretty aggressively. So we're always bringing some new company into the fold. They're not always exactly like us. So we've got to think about those continua and make sure that we understand, even in the due diligence phase, is this a good match or not? And then if things go forward, recognizing the differences. Do we leverage them, or do we try to bring things closer together? And those are things that we seriously consider with each of our integrations. So I've been with the company here for 10 years, and really the only thing that's been constant about the fact those 10 years, even my job has changed a number of times, is the fact that we're global. And now we are actually even organized in a global way, whereas we've tried different models in the past, but global is the way to go in this particular time in the whole world's history, I believe. So my story on the next slide, let's just have you guys use chat, take a look at these images and try to figure out or propose to us, what do they have in common? We'll give you just a second here to type in what you think these images have in common.
If you haven't chatted yet, you can pull that up just by clicking on it at the bottom of the screen. And when you're done, you can click on the X, it'll just kind of close it. You can pull it up at any time. We'd like to see what you think the similarities or commonality is between these.
They all make a person think and ponder. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I'll just go on that to keep things moving. They all represent the way that people at my company have felt about global teamwork at least some points in time. You know, you've got like the exploding globe, like, oh my gosh, there's so much going on. It's a complex puzzle. Oh, they're on a different world. And then you got people that just like want to give up by crumpling their paper and throwing it through. But I'll expand on each of these as we go through. So the next slide.
Words that we're getting are like just what you said: frustration,
yep,
explosion, fear, unknown. Kind of timely for today.
Yeah, and it's a little mystery to uncover. That's very nice too. So those different worlds. So I've already talked a little bit about my first experience coming into the company and how everybody was like mad the minute I came in because my group was allocated out. You know, charges were hitting their budgets, but they weren't feeling they were getting the service. So we did exactly, you know, some of that discovery work, and I had the scientists do it. You know, it wasn't just like me asking, oh, what do you want? But I engaged the team into interacting with our global colleagues. What would give you a sense of having had a good result or an enjoyable experience working with our team? And that took a while, of course, to bring some of those nuances into actionable things that we could do. But the survey clearly showed that intercultural awareness was lacking with the team at the time. And we would have examples where, you know, somebody from Asia maybe might send a request in, and then our team would send back like 2 straight to the point bullet point questions to the Asia person, who would then never respond because they didn't feel that they were, you know, appreciated or getting having the ability to bring that context out, and they didn't want to respond directly. I need you to X by Y. They weren't going to say it. So things would just stop cold because it was almost like introducing too much conflict right out of the start, even by what an American would think are some simple questions. So it was fascinating. But as I mentioned, I had prior experience with Caterpillar, MIT, and then another large global company called Celanese, where we would encounter similar problems. You know, global work is hard. And I'd had the benefit of bringing in consultants like ECCO International in the past to help with those. So I said, well, let's do that here too. And we searched and, you know, landed on ECCO as who we were planning to work with. And the team brought in this really great 2-part workshop where we explored a couple of things. One, what English as a second language feels like for the person who has English as a second language. And then 2, skills that we needed to develop to interact more effectively.
You know, and Kristy, this too goes back to our first model of aware, like know where you are and what your mindset is. And so we can get in that, this is really full of angst. And then we have more comments that are saying things like, it's a delight. It's a mystery to uncover. Working globally has been challenging, but a joy. So we're getting a lot of different comments around that as well.
Yep. And the thing that I'll usually tell people is simply, even if you just try, it comes across somehow, and people can appreciate that you're at least trying. And whether you do it well or not, it doesn't matter anymore. Just try. But this slide, what the team recognized after working with ECCO is that they had become faceless zombies. You know, they were just taskmasters, and they were doing what they thought needed to be done, but it wasn't ever going to result in the right end. So we'll come back to that later. So the 2 worlds, the 2 planets, it was all about bringing the worlds together. We created these programs in 2 of the 5 departments that I was overseeing. One was an outreach effort to just reach into the businesses globally and better understand what it is that they're facing in their regions. And the other was a project called Project Bridges, which was more about that analytical science and reaching into, again, the other research groups to get to know one another before we started to try to work with each other to solve problems collaboratively. Cut to the chase, you know, a year after we made these serious attempts to improve things, did another, you know, survey out with the teams and got tons and tons of positive feedback from especially our German colleagues who had been pretty critical in the beginning. So it was nice to see that happen. Next slide, though, the Rubik's Cube, you know, it's never enough. It's such a complex puzzle. You've got to keep on working it. And even with my first group, I had only impacted 40 of our people internally. And we globally, as an R&D group, were a team of 400. So started to think about how do we expand what this small team of 40 had learned to the whole organization. And we created these things called GTTs, Global Technology Teams, centered around the various technologies of adhesives that we produce. And we try to bring them together virtually, having never met each other face to face, to have an effective video or WebEx type experience with one another. Didn't go the best. Like, it was fine. The structure was there and we were all trying really hard. But to one of Amy's first points, like it didn't really come together until we met each other face to face. And of course, right now in this particular point in history, it's hard to get together and meet each other face to face, but video really is doing a pretty good job for us. Anyway, after about 6 or 9 months of having these global technology teams formed, but perhaps floundering a little bit, we finally decided, okay, we're going to put up the hundreds of thousands of dollars of budget to fly everybody to one place and have a big technology powwow, which was really fun to plan. And the thing that we centered on and showcased was global work, the Alive model. The very first thing that we did, not even a keynote address or a kickoff or anything, was we had the people come in and participate in training on how to do effective global work. So the first thing we asked people to do in this training was choose an image very much like the ones that we've been showing so far. And what was so funny is the crumpled paper happened. So the very first thing was a person took his image, he jammed it all up into a ball, and he threw it across the room. He said, "This is what I think of global teamwork." But you know what was so great about that is it kicked off the conversation. And it let everybody know that it was okay to have been frustrated and that we were going to get some help. And it repaired like 1.5 years of ineffective communications between certain people that this happened. So what we did in that training then is we broke out all of the teams into their small groups. We had them form in circles and do exactly what we've been discussing so far. You know, what's your charter? What are the roles? What are the rules that we're going to use as a team? And lo and behold, the whole GTT model is still working after, that was 6 years ago that this happened. So it's still in play. It's still going really, really well. One of the other experiences we had in that training was an Arctic survival exercise where the end result really did prove that if you work together as a team, you're more likely to stay alive than if you all break out into your I individualism. So
and boy, Kristy, did we ever have some cultural norms coming up in that activity? Right? I mean, it's like, okay, we're going to have to break people up into these different groups because it'll kind of be a disaster if we just, I mean, they won't have the same experience. So we made sure it was really diverse. Mm-hmm. And that was half of the conversation was about the cultural norms.
Yeah, it was really fun to see it all come together and people enjoying the experience of learning this stuff, which was also neat. But you know, really it comes down to then that credibility point that was brought up. The people in the US were always judging everyone else's competency by the tasks. They were judging their own competency by tasks. You know, the more work I can get done, the better person I am. Yeah. Not necessarily true in like 75% of the cultures out there. So just understanding that became important. Other things that came out of this exercise to create these global technology teams and make sure they work well, we're talking about the rules. What time works well for these meetings? You know, we had always been told by leadership of our company, the best times for global work are at 7:30 in the morning US time because that's when everyone's awake. Well, that's a little too early for our colleagues in Asia, and we didn't understand that until after we talked about that. Sometimes they're just getting home from work after 2 hours of traffic at that point in time, and they really want to eat dinner and see their kids for at least 20 minutes. So we just got to some of that stuff, and we recognized the need to move our meeting times, change the way we facilitate our conversations, have a scribe in our meetings, so someone's typing what's being said on the screen for people that have English as a second language. And it was really helpful to start to work some of those things into the way we work, which is why we're still going strong 6 years later with no signs of quitting. But do people still go like this from time to time? Yeah, they do. And it's because we're always bringing in new people and acquiring, but you know, we quickly get up to speed on what are these best practices. You know, we're all employing it now such that nobody even knows how it all started. And you know, it was probably also, you know, explored in other ways in other teams that I'm not aware of either in my company. But I would say that we are pretty good at working globally now, which is why we are doing so well in this global environment. And decided, yes, we're going to reorganize to a truly global structure because we can handle it. So, and that's probably why I got moved into a mergers and acquisitions role, because we can make it happen through a lot of these skills that we're learning today.
Kristy, I see some questions coming in, but I'm going to suggest that we get through the V and the E like in a really quick time frame so we can open it up and have a dialogue and unmute some people. Again, if you've got a comment to make or a suggestion or a story you'd like to share, we would love to hear more stories. Feel free to raise your hand. We're not seeing the hand raises, but we are seeing the questions. So thank you. All right, Mary Beth.
Yes, so very quickly, name the president who said, trust but verify. In your chat, anybody know who that was? And when he said it? Unfortunately, they've all been he's.
Yeah, that's not even a giveaway, right?
Anybody know? All right, it was Ronald Reagan, right?
We had a guess on Reagan. Oh, a couple. Very good.
Good, yeah. So it was Ronald Reagan, and he was saying it when we were looking at nuclear missile crises, working with in global teams with our Russian counterparts. But I think it's also really important, and that's the V in Alive. We have trust, and Kristy's just given you some great examples of how she built trust in her global teams. But we also have to verify. We have to verify. One of the key issues in global teams is accountability. We have to hold each other accountable, but we also have to verify that we're really using technology in the best way to support our global teamwork. So if we move on to the next slide, there's a lot we can do about getting a little bit more sophisticated about which medium do we use when to get the best results. And the three of us would like to just give you a quick example for each one of these. And I believe it's Kristy that's starting out.
I'm going to start. Yep, I'll start.
Okay.
But as we're giving you some of these examples, again, we have a lot of you. I mean, clearly all of us have experience with all of this, whether it's global or not, with all of these methods and tools. So we want everybody to go ahead, and it's going to roll probably pretty fast for us, but type in phone. Here's a tip I'd like to share. Email, here's a tip I want to share. And we'll make sure that those get woven in. But we know that you've got a lot of experience in this. And what in particular, if you have the global experience, would you like to add from a global virtual perspective? So starting with phone conference, plain and simple, one tip, double the time. If you think you can get it done in an hour, divide your agenda into two and do half in one 1 hour session and half in another. There's a lot with English as a second language with the process of translation. It depends on how you set up and how much advanced material you give them to review in advance. And the other thing we would suggest it within phone conferences is to summarize not only often, but at the end of the call, not only verbally with an action plan, but also in writing. Because at that point, people are exhausted, right? After an hour of constant translation. So they may not even get your review at the end. So verbally and in writing. Kristy, you had some great ideas around how you used WeChat and texting.
Yeah, so when we were working this analytical team together with the China customers, especially, once they got their relationship started, it was unbelievable how much they preferred that we use WeChat to get answers to questions about where they'd like to take the research next versus a formal email or a meeting or a teleconference of any type. They're like, just use WeChat. And so even like these quick little things could go back and forth they would answer at night because they knew that would help move the things forward, and they're already sitting there on WeChat, so use WeChat. But we also used WeChat when the coronavirus was most prevalent in China to check on each and every one of our Chinese colleagues at a pretty regular frequency. They would respond to WeChat polls on how are you doing? Are you healthy? Is your family healthy? With no problem whatsoever. Could we have gotten as quick and an accurate and complete data out of any other system? Probably not. So you always have to work with your audience and ask them, what are your communication preferences? How can I get a response from you? And where you can cater to that, cater to that.
Excellent. With video conferencing and webcast, two quick things. Turn your camera on. I don't know who globally would not be comfortable with that lately, because we've all been doing it for weeks and weeks now regularly. But, 3 months ago, I had a hard time getting people to turn it on. You, as the role model, have to use the camera. And second, avoid colloquialisms. Even as we were rehearsing, Mary Beth called me several times on some of my colloquialisms because I haven't, traveled in the last few months, and already I can see I'm getting in the bubble. And she already is saying, Amy, think globally. You're already getting stuck kind of in our little Minnesota bubble again. So that's the phrase that we use for it. So let's take a look at Mary Beth, some email tips.
So email, regardless, is still a common business tool. It's probably overused, but if you have to use it, it's really great for two things: confirming data and doing those summaries that Kristy and Amy were just talking about. And especially at this time, people are overloaded with emails as well as other communication media, and we're all competing for each other's time. So how do you get your emails answered more quickly? Here are 4 ways we know actually work that have been confirmed by research studies. First of all, make it personal. And that goes back to, we take that time to build relationships because we're all more likely to answer an email from someone we know, like, and trust. Use the person's name in the subject line. If you're really trying to get their attention, if you know they're overwhelmed, use something that you know will get their interest. For instance, yesterday I emailed a colleague of mine who moved to Paris about 2 months ago, and I knew she had finally found an apartment at this difficult time, and my email to her was, can you send me a picture of the apartment? She responded within 12 minutes. I know when I send her a business question, it can sometimes take 5 days because she's extremely busy and very overwhelmed. So that would be one example. The second thing is, if you really know it's a very critical and quick issue that you need a response to, put the question right in the summary line. Hari, do you think this candidate is good for the job? If you're working with someone, recruiting someone, and they're also working on it, and you know time is of the essence, all I have to do is say yes or no. Third, put the deadline. If it's really deadline sensitive, sometimes people put time sensitive, but that doesn't always translate across cultures. So I like to recommend you say, if you know each other well and people are comfortable, could you let me know this by this time? We have to be careful not to overuse this. If you do this all the time, people are going to wonder why we can't manage our time well. And then finally, here's an example of what you can put in the email body that really gets at all of this in one sentence. Are you free this Thursday at 12 o'clock Central Time for lunch? So I know who, what, when, where, why, and how. And frequently I find when I'm working across distances, I'll write an email and then I'll have to go back and cut to make it simple, to make it clear, especially when I'm working across language differences. The other thing I have to do, because I am an expressive person, you see it with my hands, I use exclamation marks a lot. I have to go back and literally delete, because that's just me trying to communicate my emotion. But for many people, that is static. So keep it simple, keep it straightforward. Thanks, Amy.
Hey, Mary Beth, we have a couple of ideas here too about putting a quick question in the subject line so people know it's going to be something they can answer to really quick. We're also getting a lot of laughs around. I do the same thing, and I do too, with the smiley faces and the exclamation points. We're getting quite a few comments here about subject line. That tends to be the number one thing that will be the grabber to get their attention. So thank you very much.
And I think you see something there about what about establishing boundaries to avoid 24/7 burnout. I think that's absolutely critical. That goes back to why you have that launch meeting and you set those operating principles. So to say, how are we going to treat each other and what are we comfortable with? For instance, my German colleague was going to be on this call today, and he said, you know what, you set this in American time zone, didn't you? And I said, yeah, we didn't really know we would have any international folks, so that's why we set it. He said, well, that's late my time, and I'm not going to be on it because you know that that's not okay with me. But my Chinese colleagues were saying, you know what, it's 3 a.m. our time, we'd still love to be there. And to Kristy's point, they will answer WeChat. So sometimes it's something you have to negotiate, but I love your point, Tammy, about saying, you know, make the implicit explicit. Let's have that conversation. Let's set team ground rules. And then we know we may have individual exceptions that we've all agreed on. Great question. So finally, we get to ensure, right? And ensure is the E and R alive. And if we go to the next slide, Amy, I think we can understand that there are techniques that will help us ensure that we hit our goals. A lot of times I hear virtual teams say, I don't even know if we got anything accomplished. So what can you do? These are 5 things you can do as soon as you get off this webinar that will help move the dial on your results. Number 1, we know all of these from neuroscience, that they actually work. Explain the task. It needs to be precise, specific, direct, or what we call low context. And we need to avoid jargon, especially my US American friends. We are overwhelming with our jargon. So if you're not sure if there's jargon in it, have somebody check you on it. I like to have on webinars like this, raise hand, lower hand every time I use slang or jargon or acronyms that you don't understand. And people will do it about every 20 to 25 seconds. It's humbling, but it reminds me and it gets me to simplify. Use because, believe it or not, there's a famous study that shows if you simply use because in a sentence, you will increase your compliance by up to 33%. Even if it's nonsensical, like saying, I need to butt in front of line, or I need to get at the front of the line because I need to use that copier when everybody is waiting in line for the same thing. People need to know the why. Delegate the tasks and write them down. And this goes back to something called the authority principle. So I might say, Minna, I need your project status report by Thursday because I want to review it before Friday. And if I use your name, you're more likely to do it. Some people even have shown in studies, if you can hear me clicking on the keyboard like I'm taking notes, you will be more likely to do that. I think that's a little exploitative. If we move on to the next one, we're going to set deadlines. And that goes back to what we call Parkinson's law, which some of you I'm sure know, which is if I say the deadline or we agree as a team, it's in a week, we'll take a week to get it done. If we agree as a team, it's going to be 2 days, we'll get it done in 2 days. So we need to be reasonable, we need to be clear, but we need to make the deadlines explicit. And we need to decide on what those are together, not just one person off in splendid isolation making those choices. And finally, we're going to assign responsibility. We know people are more likely to do it if they volunteer, if we use their name, but if not, we need to be specific and not say, Amy, Kristy, and Mary Beth, you're responsible, because then none of us feel that we're responsible. We have to decide on one person who's going to lead, and then you can have teammates. Hope those will be helpful to you.
And there's a comment about because actually does increase commitment to a task over compliance. And I think that's the implication. So really very nice way of putting a commitment side on that as well. Thank you for that. Continue to type into the chat box what best practices you've learned or what you're willing to try. Again, there are so many questions here. I think that we'll be able to get to some of these as we'll email to you directly. If you have additional questions, please put it in the chat box. We want to be respectful of your time and end on time. But let us know what you're going to do differently, what you think you will try, and what additional questions you have. And as I said, we will for sure email you on that. We'll go back to the main roster and find you there. So thank you for that. We want to provide you with a few global resource links. Our website, ECCO International. We have a really active blog. We've got a whole lot of articles published on LinkedIn. If you wanted to comment on this on Twitter, it's hashtag ECCO, ECCO INTL. We also have online self-paced courses at ecointernational.mykajabi.com. So please feel free to check out some of our online around global, again, global teams, inclusion at an individual level, and inclusion at a leader level. And then a series of other ones here as well. And if you do respond to the survey, we'll be happy to send you the slides with all of these resources, as well as another article. So bonus, but you'll be getting that email from us as well. Some books that we really like. Again, it's not just any one of them. There's, a lot of different authors in terms of entrepreneurs, Hofstede with Brislin, clearly here, Break. We've got a lot of different resources out there. Our suggestion to you would be to look for the most recent ones or what would be considered a classic. Mary Beth?
Yeah, and these are some key virtual teaming books. One of the areas that we're also working a lot in at ECCO right now is how to facilitate virtually effectively. It's very complex. I'm super glad Amy is running this today and not me. And most of the online that we do is through Adobe Connect, which is even more complex, as Tony and many of you know. But how do you do that? Well, this is a helpful book. These are also some virtual teaming books that I think are quite helpful. And then I brought a new book with me, if you can see this here. And again, if you get to our survey, I'll be happy to add this to the list. It's called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. It's written by a cross-cultural psychologist. I think it's really fascinating. It's a different perspective on these 5 dimensions of difference. And then finally, I think our last slide, Amy, if we move forward, is this is how you can connect with us in different ways. And one beyond that, I think, is our question to you, Amy, the next slide, which is any other questions you have for us as we round out our 75 minutes together. So we'll look for your answers there, or your questions as well.
So please feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. Email us if you want additional information. Look for the email that you'll get early next week. Check out our online tools and our articles and resources, and any questions that come in. We'll leave this open for a few moments. Any questions that come in, again, in addition to what already has that we have not addressed, we will be sure to email you directly. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and attention. A special virtual applause for both Mary Beth and for Kristy, taking so much time and effort to share these resources. Again, we're in this together. It's up to us to help you and for all of us to be in this supportive environment together as we move forward. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic rest of your day or evening.